For decades, his name echoed in whispers across borders, in nightclubs, in police stations, in government offices, and in the darkest corners of the underworld. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Lara, better known to the world as El Chapo, the man who rose from the dusty mountains of rural Sinaloa to become one of the most powerful, most feared, and most elusive drug lords in modern history. His empire stretched across continents. His tunnels burrowed beneath borders. His wars left entire cities bathed in blood. And yet, time and time again, when governments thought they had finally caught him, El Chapo would vanish, slipping through the cracks of corruption, money, and fear. This is not just the story of a man. This is the story of a system, a brutal, billion-dollar drug empire that reshaped Mexico, altered global crime, and challenged world powers. Try to watch until the end, because El Chapo's story is not only about power and crime, it's about betrayal, survival, and the question that still haunts Mexico today. Did capturing El Chapo really change anything? Let's begin. To understand Joaquín Guzmán, we must first step into the rugged mountains of northwestern Mexico, the state of Sinaloa. It's a place of beauty and hardship. Fertile valleys for farming, yes, but also deep poverty and generations of families scraping by on little more than maize, beans, and whatever the land could offer. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Lara was born here in 1957 in a small village called La Tuna. His childhood was nothing glamorous. In fact, it was painfully ordinary and painfully poor. His father was a cattle rancher and, according to many accounts, also dabbled in the cultivation of opium poppies, which were already a lifeline for farmers trying to escape hunger. His mother, Maria Consuelo, tried to hold the family together, but resources were always scarce. By the time young Joaquín was a teenager, he had dropped out of school. He could barely read and write. Education was a luxury for people with money, and Joaquín's family had none. He turned to work instead, selling oranges, tending to animals, and eventually helping his father in the opium fields. Life was rough, but it taught him survival. More importantly, it gave him his first introduction to the world of narcotics, a world that would later define him. Now, here's something important. Guzmán was not the only boy in Sinaloa growing up surrounded by poverty and poppy fields. But what set him apart was ambition. Locals remember him as short in height, a nickname like El Chapo, meaning shorty, would stick to him for life. But his ambition? That was tall. Taller than the mountains of Sinaloa themselves. In his late teens, Guzmán began working with local smugglers. He learned fast. He saw that the real money wasn't in farming poppies or selling oranges. It was in trafficking drugs across the border into the United States, where demand was skyrocketing. By the late 1970s, the drug trade was already reshaping Mexico, and Guzmán was determined to carve out his place in it. Step by step, he built connections. Step by step, he gained trust. He started as a driver, a laborer, a nobody. But the world of cartels had its own ladder, and Guzmán was climbing it. In those dusty hills of Sinaloa, a future kingpin was being forged, not by destiny, but by desperation, determination, and the hunger to rise above the poverty he was born into. By the early 1980s, Joaquín Guzmán was no longer just another young man hustling in the hills of Sinaloa. He had caught the attention of men who ran Mexico's criminal underworld. And in that underworld, there was one name that stood above all the rest: Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather of the Guadalajara Cartel. At the time, the Guadalajara Cartel was not just powerful, it was the cartel. The U.S. demand for cocaine was exploding, and Gallardo had the connections to Colombia, the routes across Mexico, and the political protection to move mountains of drugs north of the border. This was the empire Guzmán wanted to be part of. So how did El Chapo get in? Accounts vary, but one thing is clear: he proved himself valuable. Very valuable. Guzmán became known for two things: logistics and discipline. He managed drug shipments, made sure deliveries moved on time, and if a driver was late, he didn't hesitate to punish them severely. Ruthless, yes, but in a business where delays cost millions, that ruthlessness looked like reliability. Inside the Guadalajara Cartel, Guzmán worked under two of Gallardo's most trusted lieutenants, Hector El Guro Palma and Rafael Caro Quintero. He wasn't at the top, not yet, But he was close enough to see how the machinery of a drug empire worked, the bribes, the violence, the smuggling strategies. He absorbed it all like a student in class, except this was a school of crime. But with power came danger. In 1985, the Guadalajara Cartel made a fatal mistake. DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered on orders from Gallardo and his men. That killing sent shockwaves across the border. The United States unleashed massive pressure on Mexico, and the once mighty Guadalajara Cartel began to crumble. For Guzmán, the downfall of his bosses was not the end. It was an opportunity. With Gallardo arrested and the cartel weakened, Mexico's drug world fractured. Territories were divided. Loyalties shifted. And amid that chaos, El Chapo Guzmán saw his chance to step out of the shadows. The young apprentice from the mountains of Sinaloa was about to create something of his own, a cartel that would rewrite the rules of the drug trade. That cartel would be called the Sinaloa Cartel. When the Guadalajara Cartel collapsed in the late 1980s, it was like a kingdom without a crown. Its vast empire didn't vanish. Instead, it splintered into smaller groups. Each lieutenant, each strongman, carved out their own territory. And out of that chaos rose a new power, the Sinaloa Cartel, led by none other than Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. At first, Guzmán wasn't alone. He partnered with two other powerful figures, Hector El Guro Palma, his old ally, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a quiet but extremely influential trafficker. Together, they formed the backbone of the cartel. But it was El Chapo's boldness, his innovation, and his sheer hunger for power that made the Sinaloa Cartel stand out. The strategy was simple, yet revolutionary. Dominate the smuggling routes into the United States. Mexico shares a border stretching nearly 2,000 miles with the U.S., and whoever controlled those crossing points controlled billions of dollars. El Chapo was obsessed with building those routes. He invested in secret tunnels under the border, hidden compartments in trucks, and even aircraft to move cocaine from Colombia into Mexico, then north into the U.S. He turned drug smuggling into a logistics empire. And while he mastered smuggling, he also mastered corruption. Guzmán understood that a well-placed bribe was sometimes more effective than a gun. Politicians, police commanders, and military officers, many of them found their loyalty could be bought. This network of protection allowed the Sinaloa Cartel to move faster and hit harder than its rivals. But expansion was not without bloodshed. In the 1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel entered open conflict with the Tijuana Cartel, led by the Fism Oriano Felix brothers. The war turned border cities into battlegrounds. Shootouts erupted in broad daylight, assassins struck in crowded streets, and innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire. For El Chapo, violence wasn't an obstacle, it was a tool. He used it to intimidate enemies and cement his reputation as a leader who would stop at nothing. By the mid-1990s, El Chapo's name was no longer whispered only in Sinaloa. He had become a global player. His cartel controlled routes stretching from South America to the United States, with influence reaching as far as Europe and Asia. Money poured in, billions of dollars. And with it came luxury estates, private jets, and the loyalty of entire communities who saw him not just as a drug lord, but as a Robin Hood figure, handing out cash, building roads, and putting food on tables. The Sinaloa Cartel had arrived. And at its heart was a man barely 5'6", but with ambitions taller than the skyscrapers of Mexico City. Joaquín Guzmán was no longer the apprentice. He was the boss. And soon, the world would learn just how far he was willing to go to protect his empire. If Joaquín Guzmán had done nothing else in his life, he would still be remembered as the man who turned drug trafficking into an art of engineering. For El Chapo, smuggling wasn't just about moving cocaine across a border. It was about creating a system so sophisticated, so daring, that it made the impossible possible. Let's start with the tunnels. To most people, the U.S.-Mexico border is a line of fences, checkpoints, and watchtowers. But to El Chapo, it was an underground canvas. He ordered the construction of tunnels that were not crude holes in the dirt, but elaborate passageways with lighting, ventilation, and rail tracks. His first major tunnel, discovered in the early 1990s, shocked authorities. It stretched hundreds of feet, directly connecting warehouses in Mexico to safe houses in the United States. Drugs went in one side and popped out the other without ever passing a checkpoint. But tunnels were only part of the strategy. El Chapo also turned to the skies. Small planes loaded with cocaine would take off from hidden airstrips in Colombia, refuel in remote parts of Mexico, and then fly low under radar to deliver their cargo. At one point, the Sinaloa Cartel had an entire fleet of aircraft, so many that the DEA joked Guzmán had more planes than Mexico's national airline. And then came the seas. Cocaine shipments moved on speedboats, fishing vessels, and eventually, even semi-submersible submarines designed to slip past coast guards. The ingenuity was staggering. Every time authorities thought they had closed a loophole, El Chapo's engineers found another. But smuggling wasn't just about creativity. It was about scale. The Sinaloa Cartel moved thousands of tons of cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine into the United States year after year. Profits soared. By the late 2000s, Forbes magazine would list El Chapo among the world's billionaires, a recognition that blurred the line between crime boss and corporate tycoon. And yet, with every shipment, every tunnel, every daring innovation, Guzmán wasn't just getting richer. He was also getting bolder. The higher he climbed, the more visible he became. And in the shadows, enemies were waiting. Rivals, law enforcement, even his own allies. The drug superhighway made El Chapo a legend. But legends come with a price, and his would soon be paid in blood and betrayal. By the mid-1990s and into the 2000s, El Chapo Guzmán was not just a drug trafficker. He was a warlord. The Sinaloa Cartel's growth brought enormous wealth, but it also brought enemies. And in Mexico, cartel rivalries are settled not in boardrooms, but in blood. The fiercest of these enemies were the Arellano Felix brothers of the Tijuana Cartel. They controlled the busy crossing points near San Diego, some of the most lucrative smuggling routes in the world. El Chapo wanted them. The result was open warfare. Gun battles erupted in border cities. In 1993, assassins targeted Guzmán at Guadalajara Airport. They missed him, but in the chaos, a Roman Catholic cardinal was shot dead, a killing that horrified Mexico and forced the government to act. El Chapo was arrested that same year, but his cartel did not collapse. From behind bars, his lieutenants, men like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, kept the Sinaloa Cartel alive. And when El Chapo escaped in 2001, hidden in a laundry cart, he returned to a drug world that was even more violent than before. By the 2000s, the war was no longer just about Tijuana. It was about Mexico itself. Rival cartels, the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, the Juarez Cartel, all fought for territory. The streets of cities like Ciudad Juarez, Reynosa, and Culiacan became war zones. Thousands of lives were lost each year. Bodies hung from bridges, mass graves were uncovered, and fear spread like wildfire. Ordinary Mexicans were trapped between cartel assassins and a government struggling to maintain control. But El Chapo's genius was not only in violence. It was in corruption. He understood that a bullet could kill a rival, but a bribe could by a politician, a policeman, even a general. It's often said in Mexico that drug lords give people two choices, plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. Many chose silver. This network of protection allowed Guzmán to keep his empire running, even while he was a fugitive. For nearly 2 decades, Mexico's drug war claimed tens of thousands of lives. And yet, El Chapo's name only grew stronger. To some, he was a criminal mastermind. To others, a brutal murderer. And to many poor communities, he was a benefactor who provided food, jobs, and protection where the state had failed. Love him or hate him, one thing was certain: El Chapo had become untouchable, a king in a country of chaos. But kings attract attention, and Guzmán's growing myth would soon collide with the reality of law enforcement. He had escaped once. He would escape again. But no man escapes forever. For most cartel bosses, prison is the end of the story. But for Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, prison was only a pause, a challenge to be outsmarted. His escapes didn't just embarrass Mexican authorities. They turned him into a global legend, a man who could slip through the cracks of even the tightest security. The first escape, 2001. In 1993, El Chapo had been captured and sentenced to over 20 years in a maximum security prison. For nearly 8 years, he bided his time. But Guzmán had something more powerful than weapons. He had money. By 2001, after bribing prison guards and officials, El Chapo simply walked out of Puente Grande prison, hidden inside a laundry cart. Yes, the world's most powerful drug lord was wheeled right out the front door, wrapped in dirty clothes. It was almost absurd, but it worked. But the story didn't end there. In 2014, after more than a decade on the run, El Chapo was finally captured again in a dramatic operation in Mazatlan. This time, Mexican authorities swore he would never escape again. He was placed in Altiplano, the country's highest security prison. Cameras in every corner. Guards watching 24/7. Iron doors, steel bars. The works. Surely, this time, El Chapo was caged for good. But El Chapo wasn't called the engineer of smuggling for nothing. In July 2015, he vanished again. From his cell shower, the one spot cameras didn't cover, he disappeared through a hole in the floor. Beneath the prison stretched a mile-long tunnel, complete with lighting, ventilation, and even a modified motorcycle mounted on rails to carry him to freedom. It was a masterpiece of engineering, dug right under the noses of the authorities. News of his escape spread like wildfire. Around the world, people shook their heads in disbelief. How could one man humiliate an entire government not once, but twice? To many, it confirmed what they already believed. El Chapo was untouchable, a ghost slipping through concrete walls and steel doors. The myth and the reality. But for every legend, there is a cost. Each escape brought him more fame, but also more attention. The Mexican government, under pressure from the United States, could not afford to let him embarrass them a third time. The hunt for El Chapo was about to become relentless, and this time, there would be no more laundry carts or secret tunnels to save him. The world's most wanted man was running out of places to hide. By 2015, El Chapo Guzmán had humiliated the Mexican government twice with his legendary escapes. But his freedom came at a cost. He had become the most hunted man in the world. Mexico, under enormous pressure from the United States, could not afford another failure. This time, the hunt would be relentless, and it would end only one way. The net tightens. For months, intelligence agencies tracked his every move. The DEA, the U.S. Marshals, Interpol, and the Mexican Marines, all were watching. Guzmán relied on remote mountain hideouts in Sinaloa, where he was shielded by loyal locals and impossible terrain. But technology was catching up. Satellite surveillance, wiretaps, and drones began to close the circle around him. And then came one of the strangest chapters in cartel history. In October 2015, El Chapo secretly met with Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo and Hollywood star Sean Penn, who were exploring the idea of a film about his life. The meeting made headlines worldwide when it was later revealed. But what it really did was expose his location. Authorities intercepted communications tied to the meeting, giving them a trail to follow. Ironically, El Chapo's obsession with telling his own story helped lead to his downfall. The final raid, January 2016. On January 8, 2016, Mexican Marines launched a daring raid in the coastal city of Los Mochis, Sinaloa. The firefight was intense. Cartel gunmen defended fiercely, but the Marines overpowered them. Guzmán fled through underground drainage tunnels, emerging onto the streets in a stolen car. But his luck had finally run out. Authorities cornered him, and El Chapo was captured alive. The image of Guzmán, handcuffed and blooded, being led away by soldiers was broadcast around the world. After decades of escapes, betrayals, and manhunts, the most notorious drug lord of the 21st century was finally in custody. This time, Mexico didn't take chances. In January 2017, El Chapo was extradited to the United States. No more tunnels. No more laundry carts. No more protection from corrupt officials. He was placed in an American maximum security prison, a fortress designed to hold terrorists and spies. For Guzmán, the escape artist, the game was over. But even in defeat, the legend of El Chapo only grew stronger. His trial in New York would reveal the staggering reach of his cartel, the depth of corruption, and the sheer brutality of his reign. The world had caught him, but could the world ever truly stop what he had built? When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was extradited to the United States in January 2017, it marked the end of an era. For decades, he had defied governments, escaped prisons, and built an empire that spanned continents. But inside the walls of America's most secure prison system, there would be no more tunnels, no more bribes, no more escapes. In 2019, El Chapo faced trial in New York, one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the century. Over the course of 3 months, jurors heard explosive testimony from former cartel members, lovers, and associates who turned witnesses. They described secret tunnels, bribes to presidents, brutal killings, and shipments of cocaine so large they seemed almost unreal. The evidence was overwhelming. Guzmán was convicted on all counts: drug trafficking, money laundering, organized crime, and the use of firearms. The judge sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years. On top of that, he was ordered to forfeit more than $12 billion, the estimated value of the drugs his cartel had smuggled into the U.S. Today, El Chapo is locked inside ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. His cell measures just 7 by 12 feet. He spends 23 hours a day in isolation, with no contact with the outside world except through heavily monitored visits from family and lawyers. For the man who once commanded armies of gunmen and fleets of planes, this is the ultimate cage. But here's the question that still lingers. Did capturing El Chapo change anything? The Sinaloa Cartel did not vanish with his arrest. In fact, it remains one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, now run by El Chapo's sons, known as Los Chapitos, and his old partner, Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The violence, the corruption, the drug routes, they all continue. For some, El Chapo will always be remembered as a ruthless murderer who poisoned nations and left blood on the streets of Mexico. For others, especially in Sinaloa's poorest communities, he is remembered as a Robin Hood figure, the man who gave when the government failed. But for everyone, one thing is certain: Joaquín Guzmán Lora, the boy from the mountains of Sinaloa, became a symbol of ambition, of violence, of wealth, and of a system too powerful for any one man to stop. And so, the story of El Chapo ends not with a bullet, not with another escape, but with silence, a short man locked in a small cell, his empire still echoing far beyond the prison walls.